7 sections of trail have been built and are currently popular hiking trails. Once connected, this trail system will create a 30-kilometer continuous, scenic, mostly flat, historic, recreation and transportation corridor. But what was the Great Canal?
I'm Ingrid Newman with the Ribbons of Green Trail Society, and I'm speaking today with Tom Ouchi and Mas Sakakibara. And both these gentlemen were born and raised in the Bella Vista area of Vernon, and both of them grew up on farms backed onto the Great Canal. I'm going to ask each of you just to explain kind of you're a third generation orchardist, Tom?
I'm third generation, and my grandfather immigrated here in 1925, around that time. So he settled into the Bella Vista area after he had worked down in the coast for a little bit, but then he moved up to the Vernon area with a few other families, and that's where they settled. And my dad was born on the farm in the Bella Vista, and then that's where I grew up as a kid.
And how about you, Mas? You were born and raised here as well.
I was born and raised here in Vernon, and my mom and dad, they bought the property on Bella Vista Road, in the early 20s sometimes, yeah. And I was born in 1939, so when they immigrated, my dad first came here, and he worked in the logging camp down the coast on one of the islands down there. And then he called my mom over from Japan, and she worked in the logging camp as a cook. She didn't know how to cook.
You learned fast, right?
You know, a North American dinner, but like you said, they learn fast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Quite different.
Yeah.
And then your father, Tom, was Seiki Ouchi,
Yes.
and he also a farmer and an orchardist.
And also a trustee of the Vernon Irrigation District.
Yeah, he grew up on the farm, but he did work in the lumber industry for a short time. He was the one that took over the farm, I guess, and helped my grandfather, and then sort of transitioned out of the lumber industry and was sort of, quote, full-time farmer.
Okay.
And then he got involved with, he knew a lot of the older, at that time not old, but now the older people like John Bomborough and Bob Davison, Peter Tassi and that group. Dick French is another fellow. They all were part of the VA, participated in the VID as directors, I think, at one time too.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's how he got involved with that.
And so the Great Canal, it runs, as I said, on the top of your property. So growing up, what recollections, what memories do you have of the Great Canal?
I never knew it was called the Great Canal, because we always called it the ditch line.
The ditch line, okay, yeah.
And we would go up onto the O'Keefe ranch there,
Okay.
which is where he had cattle, and we would see the ditch line, and it'd be about 6 to 7 feet wide, and maybe the water in there might be about 1 foot to 2 feet deep.
Really? That much? Wow.
Yeah.
Because when you think where that came from, out
Yeah.
by Lavington, some 50 kilometers away,
Yeah.
and it was still running. You're saying 5 to 6 feet wide and
Yeah.
a foot deep. That's a lot of water still coming through.
Yeah.
Because you're at the end of the line here.
Yes.
Well, the water was actually transferred by a huge pipe that went into
Goose Lake.
Goose Lake.
Goose Lake,
And then
yes.
from Goose Lake it went into the Grey Canal.
Because I was just looking at the map thinking there must have been years you were at the end of the line and didn't get water or it would run out of water.
I never remember.
They were near the end.
You were near the end, okay.
I don't remember any of that at all.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, we were in about the middle of the way
Okay.
along Bella Vista Road. Yeah, and
Do you
we had
remember?
lots of water.
You had
Yeah.
lots of water?
And you saw those concrete boxes
Yes.
for the water.
And how did those concrete boxes work?
Well, every day there would be a man that would walk along the ditch line.
Ditch walkers.
We would call him the ditch man.
The ditch man, okay, or ditch
Yeah.
walker. Mm-hmm.
And you would let him know that when you wanted water, you either wanted 1 inch or 2 inches of water.
Wow.
And they had a gate there on the ditch line for each property
Okay.
that went into this concrete box. And if you said, well, we'd like 1 inch of water, he'd lift the gate up about 1 inch, and then the water would flow through underground, where the road was. And then it'd flow into the box. And from the box, it'd flow over, because there was a V like this where the opening for the water to flow out. And then the growers would dig a ditch along the top of the field where the water would run, and then the water would flow down the field, gravity flow. Where the orchards were, we would dig a ditch along the side of each row of apple trees
Furrow.
with the tractor. But prior to the tractor, we used horses.
Okay, like a plow and made a line.
And to do the cultivating and all that. But that was when I was really young, like maybe 2 or 3 years old.
No, but that's so interesting to realize that's how you did it back then. Wow.
I don't remember
You
any of
don't
that because
even-
I wasn't even born then. But
No, he was.
But that's so valuable to get this information from you. And so like this, it's fairly steep, your orchard, so that water would just be dripping down then, wouldn't it? Taking the soil with it and...
Yes, the water would sort of erode that soil down,
Yes.
and you'd get nice soil near the bottom of the field or the orchard. Yeah.
And then, so it's not like now you turn on the tap whenever you want and off. There'd be a certain season when you would get water.
Yeah, well, they would have the water running in the summer, starting in the spring, and all through the summer. Like right now, they have the VID water going through pipes, and they turn the water on in the spring, and then they turn it off in the fall.
Right, but with
And
that
it was
canal.
like that with that canal.
Okay, yes.
so same sort of delivery system. It's just totally one was
One was
above
a
ground
ditch
and one
line,
was
yeah.
pressurized below ground, right?
And then when you think it's coming 50 kilometers, there might be
It's
some
quite amazing.
animals falling in there or rocks falling in there. Or, there must be times when there wasn't water.
Yeah, well, like I said, I just remember
Well-
playing there.
Playing in there.
Most of the time we had, we always had water, and the domestic water, all the growers along here would build a well,
Yes.
and
That's,
and the water will seep through the soil and then go into a ditch that goes into the well. And
yeah.
then from the well, and this is all gravity flow, and from that well we used it as domestic
Pump it up
as
into
well as water for the field. Yeah, and we had 10 greenhouses, most of the growers had greenhouses, and we used the water for watering the tomato plants that we would grow in the greenhouses. Yeah.
To start them in the greenhouses, right?
Okay.
Yeah. Most of the growers they had one or two greenhouses that grow their plants that they would use to plant out in the field, because they used to lease land elsewhere, other than the property they had on Bella Vista Road.
Okay.
And we had in the greenhouse, there would be two greenhouses where we grew the plants, but the rest of the greenhouse we grew hothouse tomatoes. Yeah.
So what other plants did you grow? You had tomatoes, apple trees?
In the orchard at our place, it was kind of a mixed orchard. It wasn't all apple trees, but there would be apple trees, and we had peach trees and pear trees, and some Italian prune trees, and they were all kind of mixed together, rather than one lot of apple trees like a lot of the other growers had. Yeah.
And then vegetables? Were there other vegetables besides tomatoes?
Well, they did grow vegetables when I was really small. When they started growing vegetables, they started leasing land at other places, like out in Coldstream or out in the Indian reserves. They would lease land, and then they would plant the vegetables there.
Okay.
And a lot of the growers, it wasn't just a couple of acres. It'd be maybe 15, 20 acres,
It's quite
30.
Yeah, that's a lot.
And one year we had about 50 acres out in the Indian Reserve, and about another 50 acres out towards Lavington. And that was a lot of work.
Yeah. And then you wouldn't have had the Great Canal to irrigate. You had to use a different way of irrigating?
Well, at that time, when the property we had out in the Indian was, we had to buy a diesel engine with a pump on it.
Oh, okay.
And we could pump the water
Okay.
from the Okanagan Lake.
Okay.
But out in Coldstream, they did have water there where and it must have been part of the Great
Beagle Creek.
Canal.
Probably Coldstream Creek or something,
okay.
right? They would have pumped it from there.
Yeah.
I remember our family too. They leased land out in, say, where Vernon Golf Course in that area there, and I know they grew a whole bunch of onions up one year, and it was so wet they lost their shirt on that. I remember my dad saying that they lost everything.
Wow.
They were all rotted in the field.
And where would they sell their produce?
Well, there's several packing houses in Vernon. There was the BC Shippers and Unity Fruit, McDonald's, and Vernon Fruit Union. Those were all the packing houses, and the growers would take their produce and they would pack it at home, and then they take it to the packing house.
Oh, wow.
And the packing house would get orders from different places.
Okay.
So even the
And they would ship
vegetables
it
too?
out.
No? Like the tomatoes and that? We're all
Tomatoes, yeah.
Okay.
That's
Tomatoes, cucumbers, green pepper, cabbages.
wow.
Yeah,
But they had that Bowman cannery too, then,
yeah.
Okay.
where I remember that quite clearly, because at the end of the year we used to just rip all the tomatoes off the plants into these half bins and just take it all down.
And they would actually can it there.
Well, no, we make ketchup and that, I think
really?
is what they were doing.
Yeah, well, they would can tomatoes there and
okay.
make ketchup and things like
Yeah.
that. But they used to can beans and other produce there. Yeah.
Back to the Ray Canal, can you think of some successes, things that helped in the Vernon area?
Well, the
agriculture?
thing is that without the Great Canal, you wouldn't have the farmland up there. And the Great Canal, eventually they stopped using the canal for water because they put a pipeline in. The VID put a pipeline in along Bella Vista Road. And once they put that pipeline in, then the growers, they had to buy sprinklers, and they used sprinklers, and the water in the pipeline would be pressurized so that they would be able to use the sprinkler to sprinkle the orchard. But prior to that, if it wasn't for the Great Canal, you wouldn't have the farmland.
Exactly, yes.
And I think many of the growers bought, Japanese growers, and most of the property on the north side of Bella Vista Road were purchased by Japanese immigrants.
Very interesting.
Yeah, and I think there was Valère and Davison. They were the only Caucasians along Bella Vista, on the north side of Bella Vista Road, and the rest of the property was owned by Japanese families. Yeah, and I'm sure they wouldn't have bought the property if they didn't have water, but because they had that Great Canal there and with water running through it. I don't know when they built that canal.
1906.
Was it
It started in
1900s,
1914, it was finished.
A lot of the properties, it used to be asparagus patch, like our place and the neighboring places had asparagus
Asparagus.
growing all over the place.
Up on this hillside.
Yes. And, even after my parents had planted trees and fruit trees, there was asparagus growing all
Popping up.
over the
Wow.
place. Yeah.
Sometimes when I go hiking, I find wild asparagus.
Yeah, that's probably because...
Very interesting. So, their successes was before your time, I guess, the Great Canal.
The canal itself as an open flume, for me, is just, my memories are just from childhood and playing in there and having fun and running along the trestles and falling down. And I have recollect, because our family used to lease land on the upper side of the canal from Thorlicksons, who were a family that owned the rangeland above it. So, and I remember there's a pump station there that pumped the water to the top, and I do remember in the early days that we had for irrigation, especially along the tomatoes and vegetables.
Yeah.
I can't remember that in the orchard itself, because the orchards came in the 60s, I think, if I'm right. I believe, because vegetables growers started transitioning over to the apples. And that sort of
Okay.
not as much soft fruits, because it got so cold then that we couldn't grow very many soft fruits up in this area. But for the flumes and that, for me as a kid, that's all I really remember.
And so how about some weaknesses of the Great Canal? In what ways was it not successful or didn't work well?
Because it was just a ditch flowing over the ground.
Right.
A lot of the water seeped out.
Yeah.
Yes.
And sometimes there would be pocket gophers that would, dig holes from the ditch line into some of the orchards.
Yes.
And the water would flow through these pocket gopher tunnels.
Yes. That would not be good.
And they would lose a lot of water that way. So eventually they put in concrete slabs all along the ditch line.
That's why they did that.
Yeah.
And then that's kind of slowed the water loss.
That makes sense.
But other than that, like I said, if it wasn't for the water in the Great Canal, there wouldn't be farmers along there. And I don't think you'd see Japanese farmers owning this property here.
So back to the Japanese. I'm curious about your Japanese heritage then. So you mentioned your father immigrated in the 20s.
After he called over my mom from Japan, he worked in the sawmill down the coast. I think it was Fraser Mills. And Fintry used to be an orchard.
Yeah.
And they had a number of Japanese
Really?
people working there.
And
on the
what
factory
year
farm.
would that be then? 'Cause that's
Well, that would be in the early 30s, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah, because it was way before I was born.
okay.
Yeah.
And
And
since
it was after that they bought the property along Bella Vista Road. And like I said, most of the property was purchased by Japanese families.
yes.
Yeah.
And so did they know each other beforehand from Japan? Like, were they related? Or?
I think they knew other family members that had moved in here prior to them moving in. And I don't know if your grandpa.
Well, my grandfather worked in the forest industry in the coast initially too, and he had an industrial accident. He worked in a pulp mill and he had his right forearm crushed in a roller, so he couldn't get to the hospital in time. So they had to amputate. So he had a small stub on the bottom here. So the compensation they got from that at that time, they pooled the money with the Sugawara family and the Oizumi family.
Okay.
So those three, they bought the land in the Bella Vista where I am currently, and then another property was just close to Mass's property on Bella Vista, and then the other one was down on just on Beachcomber Bay on Okanagan Lake.
Yeah.
The Oizumi family. So they pooled their money and they started together, but as their families grew,
Yes.
over time, they decided to split the properties up, and that's how we ended up where I am now. And the other two farms are not there anymore, but they're housing now, most of those.
Yeah, you know where Crosby is?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, that subdivision used to be owned by Sugaras, yeah.
Wow.
That's your uncle?
Yep. Well, that would be my grandfather's sister.
Yeah.
But like Matt said, that whole area without the water would never developed as it has.
And so I've also heard there were a lot of workers on the Coldstream Ranch.
The thing is that after the war, once the Japanese families were allowed to leave the internments, a lot of them, moved into the Okanagan here on the ways to the coast and then across Canada. And many of the Japanese families were hired by Coldstream.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And for quite a number of years, they would be working at Coldstream, and eventually, slowly, they left. Some of them went down to the coast, some of them went out east.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and we even had young guys come to work at our farm, just for the summertime or even partly through the wintertime.
Right.
And they'd work for maybe a year and then they would move on.
Okay.
They would make enough money so that they could
Move on.
continue on, and some of them went down back to the coast and others went out. A lot of them went out east towards Toronto, Hamilton way. Yeah. And then you've got Lethbridge, which has a large population of Japanese there.
Yeah, because there's a group, quite a few of them went to that area of Alberta, right? And that sugar beets and that, I think. And
Yeah, some of them were sent there.
How did that work in the war? That many of them lost all of their property, but they didn't lose it here in the Okanagan?
Well, down the coast, 100 miles.
from the coastline.
From the
It's 100 miles. If you're within 100 miles of the coastline,
Yeah, the people
you had to relocate.
Japanese people were evacuated, and their homes and vehicles and boats
Fishing
and everything,
boats and everything.
they
lost
were all
everything.
taken away.
To imagine.
And all they were allowed to do was to take whatever they could take in their suitcase. But so they had to leave all their home belongings, dishes and Chesterfields and everything. And once they were allowed to leave the internment camp in 1949, the government had sold a lot of the property, all the property that they had confiscated from the Japanese families. And that meant they sold all the boats and homes and vehicles and whatever.
Everything.
And the Japanese families didn't have anything to come back to.
Wow. But so that didn't happen here, fortunately, then.
No, but
No,
the people here, the Japanese here, they weren't allowed to go anywhere unless they notified the mounted police, right?
Yeah.
So people say, well, this was the argument in redress too, right? They're saying, well, the people that were affected were only the people that were within that 100 mile had to be relocated.
Right.
But really, the people, the other Japanese that lived in the interior or more than 100 miles
Yes.
from the coastline, they were affected just as much. They didn't lose their properties and all their possessions and belongings, but they were still treated in a discriminatory fashion.
Yeah, they were restricted in movement.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I've heard too that for the construction of the Great Canal, so that was from 1906 to 1914, there were a lot of Japanese immigrants building it.
Yeah, that part I'm not sure of. I didn't really see that commented on by Peter in his book.
Yeah.
But I know the Coldstream Ranch was a big employer of people. Yeah, friends of my dad or my grandfather's family. Some of them came from the coast and was working there for a while, and then they'd come and work at, like Matt said, they'd come and work at our properties for a bit, and then eventually they moved back to the coast, or they moved on to Alberta or out east, right?
Yeah.
So.
And would you say there's still a strong Japanese culture? We're in the Japanese Cultural Center here, a beautiful building in Vernon.
Yeah.
So there's still strong ties.
Well, I think thanks to our families and our Mass's generation, they really tried to.
They had a Japanese hall.
Yes.
Before this hall was built, because the other hall had to be demolished. The first hall they built here was in 1934. They didn't have any indoor plumbing or indoor heating except for a great big barrel wood burning wood for heat in the wintertime. But they built it, and that's where the Japanese families would gather.
Yes.
For different events. And in 1958, somewhere around there, they had to tear the old hall down, and then they built this one here. And in 98, 93?
The new section?
This new section was added onto it, yeah.
Yeah, that came with the redress, right? That part.
Yeah. But there's a lot of donations from the local families, Japanese families around here, that contributed to the cost of building this, as well as the money from the redress foundation.
And so would you say that you can maintain your language still a bit, and your culture, the food you were talking about earlier?
I think the center, when Mass was talking the early times, that was really quite important for the community to have somewhere to gather like that.
Absolutely, yes.
I mean, that's just my take from my family's side. They were, actively involved in having the center here, and then, as the generations go, like Mass's generation, they've really tried to keep that sort of part of it going for my generation, to be able to try to keep that going for the next generation.
Yes.
I mean, it's changing quite a bit, but language-wise, it's very I mean, we have a Japanese school here, but it's mainly the Japanese that have come here from Japan or other areas, right?
Oh, really?
So they're native Japanese.
Okay.
My generation, third generation, any of my friends, we did not learn Japanese when we were younger.
No.
Because our parents wanted us to learn English and integrate into the society. But Mass's generation knew, when you grew up, you were speaking a little bit of Japanese, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was able to speak Japanese a lot better when I was young, and when I was going to school, because I'd be talking to my parents in Japanese.
Right.
But after I left, going to university and doing my teaching career, I stopped speaking Japanese.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the only time I would speak it is when I would come home and visit my mom and dad for a few days. Then I'd be gone again. And eventually, I started losing how to speak Japanese fluently. Now I have to start thinking about how do I translate this into Japanese.
Yeah.
And I have to think about that. And it doesn't come out fluently. So
Yeah, I think the language part of it, we certainly haven't been able to maintain, for sure, and through different reasons, obviously.
But the Japanese school, it was started by his wife. Well, we did have a Japanese school for a few years, and then it ended. And then when Nina
when we came back to live here because my father passed away.
Yeah, she started the Japanese school here.
Very nice.
And it's still continuing.
Oh, excellent.
And a lot of the instructions, like Tom said, are people who came from Japan.
Married Canadians, Caucasians, or otherwise, and are now living here, and so they want to maintain that Japanese identity and customs, which really adds to our center, I think, personally, because if we didn't have that group, the language part certainly wouldn't be there. Right?
Yeah, it'd be gone.
Yeah. So, we're lucky we have our center, as a community center, because there's a lot of areas in Canada that don't have a center for their own use.
Yes.
I mean, the bigger centers like Vancouver and Toronto and, Hamilton, Ottawa, I think they have, very nice big facilities, but I think we're really fortunate, and the groups that are under our center, we generally all get along, right? The judo club and the Japanese auxiliary ladies, and we have the Buddhist church in here, right? And we're quite lucky because in the other areas it can be quite fractured.
Yeah, this hall here, like Tom said, if it wasn't here, the Japanese community would be really fractured. But like Tom says, the Vernon Japanese Cultural Society is kind of like an umbrella organization with a lot of Japanese organizations
that's wonderful.
under it. Yeah, and whenever they have events, such as the Christmas party and the party for the seniors and
Spring Festival,
the Spring Festival,
Summer Festival.
Yeah, like I said, if it wasn't for this hall here, none of that would exist.
Right. Yeah. I'm going to change the topic and go talk about trails now with Ribbons of Green Trail Society. So one of our visions is to connect all the pieces of the Great Canal again and make it one nice transportation corridor. And so I'm looking at it from the perspective of a hiker, but I'm asking you from the perspective of the landowners how you're feeling about a trail being adjoining or next to your property.
I have mixed feelings about that.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear. I'm very curious to hear about them.
Well, you know, when they built that canal, they I guess they used the dirt to make a road.
Yes.
And that road is used by many people walking along as a trail.
Yes.
To go for a walk along the Great Canal. And I look up there every day and I see people walking. Yeah,
It's a beautiful view.
In that sense, it's good that there's a trail there for people to go. Maybe they go into Tom's place and steal apples.
That's what I was wondering about.
Yeah. No, I'm all for the trail systems in here, but I think there has to be consultation with the landowners that are against the trails.
Yes.
To try to mitigate the impact of people who use the trail and with the farmers. You know, there's different activities of farming, but if you take, say, orcharding, for example, there's, you know, spraying is a big issue, and people see sprayers and they think the worst, and you know, it's changed considerably since years and years ago, but you know, still people, and you can't blame them for thinking that. But when you develop these trails against farmland, you have to have the proper buffers, and we talked about that briefly, of having those buffers in place. And I'm not confident that the Land Commission is. I know they have good intentions about trying to create those buffers and making sure they exist, but it's difficult to put those buffers in place in order to have a workable buffer in a timely manner. Because when they did that canal behind us, and when the Rise development went in, it was, you know, there's talk about, you know, there's 10-meter buffer with trees and landscaping and, you know, tall poplar trees and then lilacs or whatever, you know, those sort of lower dense vegetation, which would help mitigate the spray issue. But that takes years to establish. And even now, there's places of that area that there's nothing there. Right? So people can say, well, we've created a buffer, but if there's nothing really there for 20 years, it creates conflict between the two parties. Right? So that sort of thing, I'd like there to be more, I guess, I mean, there's consultation definitely, but I think there has to be more recognition that those buffers take a while to establish. And maybe you have to, you know, use more of a setback distance-wise, rather than trying to just butt it up against there. Yeah, I just want that to be recognized, that we should work together to establish something more acceptable, I guess.